Hello and welcome to the Wolf Den podcast. I'm your host Nako, joined by my co-host Sanitsu. And this week we're here to springboard the BT8 discussion on a more general topic, but a topic that leans heavily into next set, especially on game complexity of mechanics. Um, we've been meaning to talk about this for a while, but we really wanted to include BT8 as there are a lot of new mechanics there. So we decided that even though the set is delayed, we figured we wouldn't delay our discussion on it and instead just kind of give us more time to theory craft and talk about it prior to its release. So, what are your initial thoughts, I guess, just looking at BT8's mechanics and what it adds to the game complexity specifically, I guess?
So BT8 is actually adding a lot more than people realize. So it is adding a new way to digivolve our cards. So it's adding specific name-based evolutions. It's adding the armor purge ability, which helps the survival of Digimon immensely, just because there was a bit of a removal problem in Digimon where everything just dies to removal. And now we actually have a way to try to combat that on top of the fact that it is introducing the Jagras slash DNA Digivolution ability, which completely changes the game on its head just because of how that mechanic works. Not only just fusing literally two bodies onto the same on the field into the same Digimon, but also giving that same Digimon that you're digivolving into a completely clean slate to work with, not only to attack with, but abilities wise. So it's counting wholly as a new Digimon that has already existed onto the field, similar to how Tamers worked for hybrids. So there's just a lot of stuff going on into the set that makes it a little bit more daunting to try to take it all in and digest than some of the other sets prior.
So that there's a lot to really dive into there, but we still didn't really touch on all of it just because there's that much to really discuss in BT8 alone. It's also the true introduction of two-color Digimon as opposed to the this Digimon is treated as X color on your turn or on all turns, as we've seen in the past. But they're true two-color for all purposes in security, in trash, in raising, everything. They're treated as both colors, physically printed on the card: yellow, red, yellow, blue, green, yellow, black, red. Um, they can digivolve from both colors in most cases, as well as two new floodgates, unique floodgates, I believe, as of now, but purple unique floodgates too, in that purple receives a new floodgate in the form of Psychomon. All turns, players cannot reduce play costs, so it's a floodgate that hits both players. Just nobody can reduce play costs. And then the black, uh, all turns, players cannot ignore Digivolution requirements, Kokuamon. So, fairly unique abilities, but uh, hitting both players is, I guess, their downside as opposed to the floodgates we've seen in the past. Um, so yeah, that's a lot to begin with, and I a lot of the specifics I think we'll go over more as we touch upon them. But what do you really think, I guess, about all of these new mechanics coming at the same time?
I think it's both exciting and scary all at once. So my initial reaction to Two Color Digimon was very cautiously optimistic is probably the best way I could put it. I like the possibilities that they open up, but I also fear the fact that the color identities could start mattering less and less because these two color Digimon exist to basically bridge the gap between the colors, fusing them as one. And I'm more specifically afraid of them being on level fours and level fives because I label those as transitional levels, where it's like your level three is obviously the start. You're not transitioning into anything. Level four and level five is where you could start utilizing these two color Digimon to completely break boundaries and go in routes that the game's not designed for, especially with the older cards because they had no idea this was going to be coming and being a thing. well, until it was made, um, which was obviously much later. And then the level fives are the same type of transitional thing where it allows you to take advantage of lots of different low ends, where the level fours lets you take advantage of lots of different high ends. So I think it's very exciting, but very scary and nervous at the same time. And then I really do like just the difference in evolutions because it could help flesh out certain cards and certain abilities on what you could use with those cards. So now that we have like the armor Digimon, let's just take Halcymon as an example. It makes Hawkmons a lot more playable. So now you could build a Hawkmon aggro based deck. Same thing with uh, Armadillomon and something like Submarinemon. Like it fleshes out more cards that weren't previously being used and adds extra usability to them, which is what I generally like seeing in a card game is like not completely abandoning everything old for the new stuff, but encompassing the old with the new.
Yeah, there's I guess a lot to be said as far as the two color Digimon are concerned because while I think their initial foray is very flavorful, um you see a pretty good combination of colors represented in their mechanics. More specifically, like Submarinemon as an example, a blue-yellow Digimon. Um, his ability being when Digivolving, trash the bottom Digivolution card of one of your opponent's Digimon, blue. Then one of your opponent's Digimon with no Digivolution sources gets minus 3000 DP, yellow. Like a perfect representation of what a two-color Digimon probably should be. It is because it's combining two previously like color-specific mechanics, while not specific, very flavorful to those colors. You know, the blue source removal we've seen heavily featured throughout the last couple sets, especially with blue hybrids being as prominent as they are right now, and minus DP of yellow being, I guess, mostly a staple of previous yellow decks because we haven't really seen any heavily feature it besides, I guess, Wyvern's Breath recently. But like Lord Nightmon was strong mostly for its plethora of minus DPs that I could throw around.
Same with Yellow Wargreymon and BT4. Like
Hmm.
I truly think like the reason why we kept swapping out our decks and we kept changing things up every single set was because they were laying out foundations for us to start building upon. And now we're getting into set 7, set 8, set 9, EX2. These are all decks that, while yes, they do have their foundations, they want to be playing and interacting with stuff we previously already had to make a more grander experience. Granted, there is going to be a time where it's like super limited just because now you're just playing the best of Vmon. Like, yeah, that's kind of boring. You're not really getting to be creative, but with more Vmons and more stuff to do with said Vmons, that's where it starts opening itself up.
Yeah. Um, it's not, I guess, immediately evident in BT8 because it's still forming that foundation, but I think it's solidifying that foundation because um, it it starts some new things, a lot of new things, I guess, mechanically, but also thematically with um, like the entire Black Red War Greymon lane or Black War Greymon line. Um, it really like gives a greater reasoning and purpose to the like purple yellow Mastamon and with the combination of Jogress and the purple yellow starter deck in Ophanian Fall Down mode. Um, just really uh, I guess ironing out cores of identities beyond this is a purple deck with a specific mascot that we change out set wise, you know, because it's not necessarily that anymore. Um, we get new mascots, we get new level sixes, we get new level sevens, but we're retaining more of what we had previously because they are more entrenched as far as aligned with what the decks want to do and the deck focus not necessarily shifting too much. Um, the easier example being, as Zenitsu was kind of already brought up, the idea of yellow, yellow War Greymon in BT4 to yellow Lord Nightmon in BT5. Both DP minus um, base decks, yellow being their only color, but also they kind of played fairly differently, and that noticeable difference in play style, even though they were both like DP minus yellow decks, Lord Nightmon was much more on the edge of control and kind of going wide, controlling the board, removing threats as they come up. Whereas Yellow War Greymon was way more I'm I'm here to end you in, a single turn. I swing, I restand, I swing again. I trash my own security, playing, close to the line that way, gaining from said reduced security. And I think just the idea that we are now forming these cores that are then going to be used in the future prospective sets I think is a really positive idea.
And this is kind of reflected in a lot of how like these cards are being designed, like Chimeramon. Chimeramon is an absolutely busted card for BT8, not only just because he's a rainbow evolution, he's a white Digimon that also on the field can count as anything that is underneath him color wise, but he's also a Jagras that anything could use. So any deck that has the ability to spawn out level 4s for free or for like extra cheap wants to use Chimeramon. Lord Nightmon has the ability to do that with Gladimon. It also has Mimicmon as just another cheap hard play level 4 to just do something. But you could use that also in War Greymon, and it might even be easier in something like War Greymon because he has easier access at manipulating your security, because that's what his core or foundation is about. He's about manipulating your security and using it as a resource to gain advantage. Lord Nightmon is more about field advantage and trying to go as wide as you possibly can. And Chimeramon's a card that could take advantage of both of those strategies for both of those cards, which is what makes him really good. But this, again, extends to basically just anything that can spawn out extra bodies could make him usable. So this could even make something as niche as Leopardmon more usable just because you have an easy way to spawn out a level 4 to easily hard play another level 4, Jagras, swing, there's your pressure point. Like it's just really interesting to see the direction that they're taking and the Digimon that they're choosing. And I'm absolutely loving a lot of the flavor that's also fitting in with the cards as well. Because they could just make it this, they could have made Chimeramon anything they wanted. It didn't necessarily specifically have to be Chimeramon in terms of his overall effect, but for extra flavor, he is Chimeramon because of what he represents in the show.
Yeah. Um. So something we still didn't mention was um. Not only are there two-color Digimon, but there are also two-color Tamers and two-color options. And just to explain their mechanics, is they work under the same rules and principles that they've always worked under, meaning that a two-color tamer activates both colors of their respective. It is treated as a blue tamer and a green tamer for the purpose of casting option cards. Um, but the option cards carry the double requirement, at least, not coming out of security, that you must be able to legally cast them using both colors. You must have, like, so for Dark Gaia Force, you must have access to both black and red in your play area.
And granted, while it's easier just to have a two color tamer set up, we don't really have a whole lot of those. And even just if we opt to look ahead, we still don't have that many for lots of different color combinations. So you're still going to have to find alternative ways to make those options work if you are to try to cast them from your hand, which that may trip up a lot of players because usually when they see two colors, they're just like, oh, as long as I have one, I'm good. This is one of the instances where as long as you have one, you're actually not good. And that's a extra layer of complexity that now you have to balance. Granted, like I stated before, just running a two color card easily meets the requirements because it's both, but depending on the deck, that might not always happen.
I know you've said you've like cautiously optimistic about the two colors. Um, I know coming from Magic, two color decks are definitely not uncommon, if not them being not necessarily more common, but especially as um, the set you get deeper into like the sets in a standard block before sets are removed, two or I guess even like more recently three color decks are becoming more the norm. Especially most of my experience coming from Ravnica sets, specifically a Magic set that gives specific names and identities to two color pairing combinations. So for us to introduce a Ravnica like block in Digimon, I think like initially when I saw it was I was overjoyed at the idea of a two color deck. The problem is with Digimon, because of our limited card pool, uh, we really don't have the same flexibility that I would I guess like to have, because you can't really just make a two color deck. You're running the two color deck at the moment because of just the limited card pool. Um, but what it really drove for me was the idea of, since memory is colorless, how can they make two color Digimon or Tamers or options not just strictly better than their one color counterparts? Because if you look, you can just see why not just run a transitory level 4 or 5, and then I could run either, red or blue or black or red level 6s, and it never matters because all of my level 5s are two color. Therefore, my level 6s have no requirements as to I could go very like far in one direction or the other. I could run an entirely, red based Black War Greymon deck and then run exclusively two color level 5s and then run exclusively the opposite, like just only running black level 6s as the example. Um, Obviously, these decks want to run their premier two color level 6, but as far as decks have been in the past, they've been more generally color based and not necessarily as archetypical as they're leaning towards now.
Yeah, the archetypical, like right now, this is just the early woes of that. Because, like, yes, if you are playing as of right now, red black, you are playing either more into the Black War Greymon stuff, or if you're still trying to make it work, Ragnarlordmon. Like, that is a black red color identity. Like, certain Digimon just already, based on the cores that they've laid out, started to adopting what their identity is, and now as we're getting two color Digimon, it's fleshing some of that out even more. So like Tyrannomon as an example, a lot of people really like Tyrannomon. So Master Tyrannomon works with both green and red, and the deck, depending on how you build it, is completely different just because of the type of tools that green is playing versus red is playing. Red wants to be more low to the ground aggro. Just because you sit on a Master Tyrannomon, he's going to give them all security tech +1. If you're playing in green, you don't really have the best tools to do that, and you're playing more of a traditional stack-based deck. Let me go all the way up into my Rust Tyrannomon, and then let me make a very powerful Rust Tyrannomon. Like it is interesting in which directions these colors want to be played in these transitional Digimons, and again, the limitations that we currently have due to the lacking cards in our card pool is just leaning us more towards these like this style of play.
And I guess a lot of it comes back to the colorless nature of memory, because the restriction in Magic as far as how many colors can I run and how many of each color do I want to run has always come from, well, what is your mana base going to be? What color options are you providing to the deck? How many dual lands are there? How efficient are those dual lands depending on which format you're playing? Um, and I struggle to make an actual comparison to Digimon because, again, memory is colorless, and if all Digimon that you're trying to run are two colors, what makes them just better than their one color counterparts. And uh, like looking at some of these Digimon, I see um I guess
Usually
some
you're paying more
downsides.
expensive. Yeah,
Yeah, it
usually
just makes them
because they're
more
two
expensive.
colors. Right, that's like the catch. It's like you
Or more
get a
expensive in specific scenarios.
right.
Cause
And
um
and I
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, and I think that's like on purpose because of how easy it is to run multiple colors as is. Like we already see in hybrid meta BT7, just because the cores aren't necessarily super fleshed out or just the style of the deck on how it wants to be ran, we could easily run a completely secondary color and not harm the deck in any way, shape, or form in terms of its overall consistency. So I think the more colors we introduce, the more like not really colors, but like the more two color cards that we introduce, the easier it is it's going to be to run those two colors or be able to run a multicolor deck. And then what is actual color identity at that point? It's like we already have the ability to start on a yellow egg, go into yellow blue, then go from yellow blue to yellow red, and then end on a red black Digimon. Like we could already theoretically just ignore colors completely to be able to gain various abilities that a Digimon probably should not have. And that's kind of like my big initial fear, but it seems like the trade off for that is they are more expensive and they're trying to be more archetypical so that way you're de incentivized from trying to do that.
Yeah, that's I guess a really good example of like the extremes as you've mentioned. You could take, you could almost, make a full circle around the color pie with a different number of combinational Digimon at the moment, even with just the few color pairings that we have in access as of BT8. But what I was really kind of concerned with was the flexibility offered. And, but, so to combat that flexibility, they've decided to kind of go the archetypical route. And we are in its early stages, but just I don't really want us to fall into that archetypical trap because it's kind of easy from a design standpoint, and the easier it is, the more likely it is to happen. And just the idea that we lose like color identity, so to speak, and you're no longer playing a blue deck, or your blue deck is so much different than other blue decks because you're running whichever blue Digimon or blue X color Digimon line up with. Like, I mean, it's fair to say that right now, like a blue green deck is borrowing ideas from blue and green, especially when you look at blue green Jogras, Imperial Dramon. But in a world where you care less about the colors of those Digimon and more about the attributes or the naming conventions of those Digimon, like in the form of Armor Rush. Armor Rush is a fairly color agnostic deck, besides the fact that Vmon is blue and is therefore it leans more blue. But besides that, like there's a quite a wide spread of color pairings that Vmon can transition into. And then looking at the armor option cards, most of them specify, like, so Fire Rocket, a red option card, while you have a Digimon with armor in its traits, you can ignore this color requirement. Or Plasma Shot, yellow option card, while you have a Digimon with armor, you can ignore this color. And I feel like we're seeing that more, and it's making it so these option cards are exclusively playable within their defined archetypes.
And that could be a good thing and a bad thing, but that's like the nature of the complexity that they're trying to, I don't want to say avoid, but like because of the nature on how colors work and the introduction of these two color pairings. And this is just one aspect on the overall complexity on just the changes that BT8 is making into the game. Because if they were to go the more generic route, which we do have some generic cards, like Kogamon as an example, where it's a purple yellow Digimon, there is zero reason never to not run this card if you're trying to gain that retaliation effect for both purple and green. Um, just because he could digivolve off of both, he counts as both, he has a solid ability, like there's just no real reason not to run it, and that's kind of the fear in which I thought that they were going to be taking is more cards like this. But to counteract that, that's why they started making more archetype based stuff, and it's almost like these color pairings are archetypes rather than actual just two color cards that you want to play. So there is a balance that they're attempting to try to do, and I don't know exactly what the end result is. It depends on how deep they decide to go on what two color means and what two color cards further get made in the future.
And if they even stop at two colors. Like, I mean, we already have Rainbow Digimon, which I guess is the easy approach from the other end. You make one color, you make two color, and then you just make all color. But I feel like the all color have been very limited so far, or very specific. Exclusively Usanamon and Chimeramon so far. Um, but um, I think I guess what I'm imagining is what I remember from Magic, right? You'd see somebody on Reddit who'd say something like, "Hey, help me build a yellow blue deck." That's not yellow's not even a color in Magic, but like, you know, I want to build a white black deck. I like what white does and I like what black does. And you could have someone depending on the different block or which, archetypes are kind of sub-supported through those mechanics at the time. You'd have someone say like you could either build this really cool knight vampire deck. Knights are white, vampires are black, and there's some knight vampires or some combinations of maybe the vampires have life steal so they gain you life, and then the knights have some mechanic that when you gain life they get stronger or something. And that's the color mirroring right there. That's the sub architectural support is that there's just broad categories that are then supported via, color um, like synchronous pairings or but you just kind of can't see that in Digimon right now, and I know we're vastly limited in our card pool, but it feels like they're trying to avoid those kinds of situations because of the way they're printing these cards. I mean, just looking at the two color cards, I mean, Metal Greymon, BT8 Metal Greymon's a very strong card, probably one of the better two color pairings we've seen so far, and it does match black red fairly well. But that being said, it doesn't just match black red well, it matches black red Dragonkin Machine because that's the only thing that it benefits as far as its inheritable is concerned. So any other black red Digimon or black or red, because it could be the go between the two. If it isn't Dragonkin or if it doesn't machine, it might as well not exist, which is fairly restrictive.
Yeah, and then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we get something like I mentioned Kogamon before, but Dino Human, where like literally any red and any yellow deck could run this card with zero downside, with it having a pretty decent inheritable ability. That's not even limited to once per turn. Wow. All right.
No, nope.
Anyway,
So,
um,
well, I guess that matters because both yellow and it's still somewhat flavorful though, because so the level fours I think are done well. Um, I wasn't even sure who Dino Human was until I scrolled through BTA, but yeah, all the level fours thus far I think are done well. Even the armor Digimon I think are done well because I know um it this will probably go up first, but just talking about decks that are potentially going to be a thing like Yellow Hybrid is going to be a decently stronger deck in BT8, unlike the other hybrids, which I think get significantly worse. And Rapidmon's a good reason for that. It's a 4 cost that evos for 4. That is ridiculously expensive. But it's also a mini Shine Greymon for 4 with Armor Purge. So, um, that's like I guess equivalently costed. especially because it can digivolve from any Terriermon for 3. Um, the yellow hybrid obviously doesn't run any Terriermon, but that's the point, is that they value its when digivolving to suspend an opponent's Digimon for each tamer you have in play, and then up to 3 of your opponent's suspended Digimon get minus 5 KDP for the turn. They care about that enough, and the armor purge on top of it, on a 4K body, for it just run it wholesale without ever running Terriermon.
Like there's instances where they're doing it right and they're doing it wrong, and well, not there's not really a right and a wrong. There's instances where they're doing it in a more tasteful manner where it
Mm-hmm.
is taking both aspects of both and it can work with both colors no matter what. But there's also the restrictiveness where sometimes they're just limiting it to a deck because that card is super powerful and they don't just want to have color pies be broken completely wide open because they just decided to not make a restriction on that card outside of it being extra expensive. And then the problem is if they make it too expensive, depending on the type of a card, then it just becomes into an unplayable territory no matter how strong it is. They're just not going to pay for that cost because it's just not the more productive thing to do. There's more efficient lines of play that you could get even though it's less powerful, it's you still get a higher output based on some of the other cards you could be playing. So it's a very fine line that they're treading on, and I'm entirely curious to see them try to support both because if we look even further ahead, they kind of still are supporting both, where you have some generic ones, then some archetypical ones. Um, but taking a break from just talking about two colors this whole time, there is just a lot more usability on a lot of the cards. Two colors is just a result of that higher usability, where it's just like this card has multiple different ways on how it could be played. And that's kind of like what they've been striving to do on a lot of the cards. And we saw that even as early as BT7, where it's just like you have these new hybrids where it could digivolve off of a level 3, it could digivolve off of level 4, it could digivolve off of a tamer. That's three ways you already have to be able to play the card, and that seems to be the direction that they're leaning with a lot of these other cards. Jogresses, doesn't matter what one of the two colors that it's asking for, as long as you meet the color requirements, you could easily Jogress. Granted, there are cards to easily set it up with, but you're not limited to just the cards in its natural evolution line that make itself easy to play. You could play it with almost anything. And that's kind of like the beauty on just being able to utilize your cards in various different ways based on how they're wanting to be played and what they're trying to interact with.
Yeah, the easiest place to start with Jogress, honestly, is Chimeramon, only because it's the premier example. The potentially the reason why Savior Huckmon had to be restricted. Um,
Well, there's a
just
lot of reasons.
yeah,
Just Chimeramon's the reason for a lot of problems, and they didn't want to
and
admit that
Eismon.
Chimeramon was, yeah, Icemon 100% was a dumb card, and then Chimeramon just made it even dumber.
Yeah,
Just because of how Jogress worked, the fact
yep.
that you could like
You could
discard turn like one or two, two Icemon, easy Chimeramon for essentially zero, swing with that, have it potentially live, then go into a Mega turn one was kind of just super not
yeah.
healthy.
Um,
And and the Savior Huck, because it tucks a level 5 underneath, now you have a Chimeramon with a Sistermon on the field that could multi-attack. Like it was the problem card, but they decided to dance around the problem
mhm.
to not kill off the card itself. Because the card does make a lot of like very interesting things possible and a lot of decks playable because of it.
And um, at least I guess to give Bandai some credit here, they're not the only ones that do this. I know in Magic it's common to see cards restricted or limited, or banned outright because they do that. I mean, I guess we do that now, but um, where they weren't even necessarily the problem card, they were just an enabling card that made the problem more evident or easier to access. Um, and so Chimeramon, starting from that point of it, it's a Rainbow Digimon. It could be any. And just the flexibility of it can evo for 0 if you ever have two level 4s out, and specifically for its usages as far as like improving quality of decks or speeding up decks. I found that there's very, very, very few decks that don't want to run at least one copy of Chimeramon. Only on the off chance that you do have level 4s out, you can swing with two level 4s if you're up against a deck that you're not risking dying from security from doing so, or just taking those two fours, making a level 5 for 0, tucking, potentially killing something, but just kind of recurring, um, potentially up to a level 5 inheritable, usually a fairly strong one, especially the ones we've mentioned recently that BT8 allows. Savior being limited to 1, this allows you to recur that. Nettle Greymon allowing you to attack unsuspended Digimon. Um, and all of that on top of the fact that it can then attack, and it's treated as a wholly new Digimon, as Anitu just mentioned. Um, but I guess going further into like kind of returning to the a little bit without exactly mentioning it is a good example of proper mechanical and color identity is Shockumon. I think that's a great card, only because it is a little expensive. It's a 4 cost from a blue or a yellow. It is blue or yellow. It can also DNA Digivolve from a blue and a yellow. Has to be one blue, one yellow, but if you have two color Digimon, that's less relevant, as we just said. But when Digivolving, if you have 5 or fewer security, so as long as you're not playing yellow hybrid, or even if you are, recover 1, then when DNA Digivolving, return an opponent's Digimon whose level or less than or equal to the number of cards in your security to its owner's hand. So combining the recovery of yellow and the bouncing of blue, beautiful card. I love it. I really do.
And that just goes to show like the higher usability and the different methods in which we have to actually be able to use the card just increase the overall potential that these cards have. And BT8 just is really starting to show the overall complexity on like how certain cards are being made because it like each color does have something it specifically wants to try to do. And these two color cards kind of fuse that together and like with hybrids just the difference on how we could play them make them way more usable. So like going back to the armor Digimon, like oops, that's not an armor Digimon. Going back to the armor Digimon, you could digivolve it for less on top of its desired level 3, or you could just digivolve it normally for whatever its cost is. There's two alternative ways for you to be able to use that card. And like that's just the whole point is higher usability leads to more engaging gameplay because now you have different approaches to what these cards are capable of. So that's why blue hybrids or like just hybrids as a general were a lot better than every other deck is because they just had higher usability on their cards as a whole. Their tamers were now level 3s for the level 4s to digivolve off of multiple ways, and that just starts cascading into not necessarily like hyper complexity, but just again lots of different things that you could do. And sometimes that might cause analysis paralysis where it might overwhelm certain players. But these mechanics at the end of the day are still relatively simple to understand. Mastering them and building a proper deck utilizing them is going to be a lot more challenging as a result, which is partially why they might have gone into archetypal based strategies, is to again limit the colors to colorness and restrict its possibilities with the like colors as a whole, on top of making it a little bit easier to try to figure out how to utilize cards. But the important thing to note is they're not always just strictly replacing the cards that we have. You could still play around with some of our older cards. Like I've seen Japanese lists for like Imperial still use BTO3 Imperial. Like these cards are all still relatively playable because those foundations were laid out on what they can do, what they want to do, and now they're just building upon those types of mechanics with a whole new set of mechanics to make more usable cards and better lines of play possible.
I know you started with it and you ended in a very different place, but I had already kind of figured out where I wanted to go with that anyway. So the armor Digimon, I think, are done fairly well. I think that even though armor purge as itself is a frustrating mechanic, especially when you realize that rookie rush is going to be stickier than ever. Um, and it won't be Rookie Rush anymore. It's Armor Rush now. Um, it's a very toe in the water introduction to which they then vastly expand upon in BT9 of the idea of um, digivolving with when specific conditions are met, as opposed to its top left underneath the play cost digivolve cost. So all the armor Digimon have that top text in black. Digivolve X from X, Digivolve 3 from Terriermon for Rapidmon, Digivolve 3 from Vmon for Magnamon, Digivolve 2 from
Digivolve for
Hawkmon,
2.
from Halsmon. All of these having completely color agnostic um, requirements. But I guess the toe in the water for the new mechanic, as far as that's concerned, is that happens also, I guess, everywhere, but more importantly, raising. So we can now digivolve into these armor digivolve Digimon uh, in raising, regardless of color, regardless of um, what it says on the card outside of that top line of text.
And BT9 reflects this even more with even more usability on how to play our cards, with cards digivolving not only from the same level, but on top of basically one another. So you could go in BT9, there's Agumon and then Agumon X Antibody. So you're evolving a level 3 on top of a level 3. So if you don't see your level 4, for this is again in BT9, if you don't see your level 4, you still have ways to continue building up your Digimon to try to see that level 4 to then continue your lines of play. So they're just trying to increase the usability of a lot of these cards so that way, like, we just got a mulligan system for a lot of our events. I barely even mulligans because the card usability is just that much higher, where I'm less prone to brick because the cards have more ways I could use them.
And while that's, I guess, a good thing, as far as I would like to be able to play more with the cards I have and have more options, it definitely makes the game faster in some regards, as far as um, if you aren't for whatever reason seeing your pieces quickly enough, you can get outpaced by your opponent, especially in the form of like against an armor rush where you can't just play your board wipe and clear their board because they're just going to shed their top layer and keep going. Um, in most cases, it just being like a jamming Vmon underneath, which can still swing um, boldenly. Uh, but I guess more so in the lines of like if you're seeing your pieces more consistently, it widens the gap between a good hand and a bad hand.
E- yes, which is why having the mulligan system is nice because it's just a nice safety net to have to again try to reduce the amount of non-games. And that's what they were trying to do because Japan doesn't have the mulligan system in place. So they have to figure out a way to basically make their cards as playable as possible without that mulligan system in place. And now that we, for at least events, do have that mulligan system in English, our evaluation on what we're playing and how we're playing changes dramatically because of just what we can do with our cards and the rules in place for us versus what Japan has. So, like this, I don't want to like harp on Japan because they do just fundamentally play the game differently than we do, and we can only look at Japan for so many different things. Um, and even though having certain card knowledge in advance is always nice, um, again, our BT7 meta was completely different than their BT7 meta. We're going to have restrictions in place for BT8 that they didn't have for their BT8. So we can't necessarily trust 110% of their data and their results because we don't know what's going to change between our format and theirs, not to mention when cards were released and all of that stuff. But as far as like the overall complexity, um, mulliganing is another layer to added complexity because now you have to evaluate, okay, my hand is playable, but these aren't the cards I want. Do I mulligan and try to find the ones that I do want? Or do I keep this mediocre hand because it has one card that I want and need for my combo like go smoothly. So there is just a lot of extra nuance to being able to use your cards and what you should be evaluating when it comes to actually building and playing your cards.
Now, I know we've discussed the additional mechanics and what they mean, but something that I wanted to add here, at least just so that we can talk about it later. But so like the small seed of doubt, I guess, that started with this set, that continues is as Zenitsu mentioned, like this fear of like things being too generically playable, I guess, because then you kind of just see them everywhere. Chimeramon, while generically playable, I think is kind of fine. Obviously, it killed Eismon and it kind of killed Jessmon. Not exclusively. Jessmon was a combination of factors, but um, the I think the intro. So there's a red tamer in BT8 Hero. It's one of the Ghost Games tamers, and it starts a trend that continues through the next couple sets, at least for the foreseeable future. That while it is a colored tamer, it is has a generic applicable use that I think is something that they probably should avoid. As much as I like generally applicable things, I still like them defined to their color identity because at least then you don't end up with the purple Mimi situation where any deck could run purple Mimi and gain value from it, regardless of whether it's a purple deck or not. But Hero's ability is that when you attack with a Gammamon or a level 5 or higher Digimon, no color mentioned there, you may suspend it to give that Digimon plus 2000 DP for the turn. And it's a memory
Which is
tamer.
Yeah, which is really good because if you're not a deck like if you notice your deck is lacking the weakness of not having a way to solidly boost their Digimon's DP on their higher levels, so that way they could survive easier, that's a perfect card to throw in, on top of the fact that now you're also throwing in an off-color card, which means now you could start thinking about splashing in off-color options and maybe off-color various other tools that the deck can use to take advantage of that thing that you were just playing with. So BT9, we get another tamer that's along those lines, where it is another Ghost Games character, and it is a blue tamer that just again has another generic effect that states something more specifically with his team, like his Digimon based on the show, and then just something generic that everyone can use. So like it does just open up a lot of like deck space and deck possibilities at the risk of being too generic where everyone could use this and there's real no reason why you're not running.
You skip the more problematic one too. EX2's Alice McCoy.
Yeah, like there's slowly showing like they're slowly getting into that space, and like that was part of the problem on why Davis was so expensive, is because there's zero reason for a blue and potentially a green deck never to not run that card,
Yeah,
just because it helps with the deck's consistency, it helps with the deck's efficiency. It's just one of the best tamers because of how generic it is. Now, Tommy is a not Tommy. TK is a little bit of a different case, just because he is generically good. He doesn't necessarily specifically state that you have to take only yellow cards, otherwise you can't take anything. Um, but he was only so expensive because there was no other replacement card for yellow to use. Now that in BT8 we're getting Kari, we'll see how that affects things, but I do think TK is still just the better card because of all of the extra things that it could grab.
yeah. Um, I at least like to touch on Alice McCoy a little bit. I know it's like pretty far-reaching, but potentially the first one that at least I'm looking at and seeing like this is kind of a problem because um, Alice McCoy is very cheap. She's a two-cost purple tamer akin to Mimi, purple Mimi. Your turn, once per turn, when a level 5 Digimon would Digivolve to level 6, you may delete one of your other Digimon to reduce its memory cost by 3. And it's just one of those things akin to Hidden Potential Discovered or Um, you know, Mega Digimon Fusion, that like cost reductions in Mega Digimon Fusion was technically color agnostic. It was white, and white is not that hard to get anymore as far as tamers are concerned. Um, but even HPD being exclusively locked to green was worth restricting to one, and now Mega Digimon Fusion is banned completely. Alice McCoy being a two cost purple, like it is literally cheaper to play her if you have another, if you can meet her requirements. It's cheaper to play her, like her cost reduction is more than her actual play cost, even if you only use it once.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of in the situation where 60% win rate, where it's like there is a pseudo downside. Depending on the deck, you could mitigate the downside considering there's lots of Digimon with solid on delete effects that could like you could use this as a trigger for. So, like in red, as an example, you could go back to BTO2 Biomon and use BTO2 Biomon, which has an on delete ability of gaining the memory. So you could be like, okay, Alice McCoy's just sitting on the field. Hard play, Biomon, move my level 5 out, Digivolve, not exclusively in that order. Um, Move the level 5 out, hard play Biomon, Digivolve, reduce it, and gain a memory. It's a lot. It's a lot that can happen, um, and it's enabling a lot of different. Like the cool thing is, it's enabling a lot of different strategies. The downside is it also could start limiting design space because of just how good it is. And a lot of these tamers kind of follow into that suit, which again could start changing how we play and deck design as a whole. Um, which is both cool and scary at the same time, similar to how like two color Digimon are just cool and scary depending on their approach and how they use them.
Yeah, I guess my big fear is that just like Hidden Potential, just like Mega Digimon Fusion, Alice McCoy will then restrict um, just options. You can't potentially make a super strong level 6 Digimon that costs a bunch because Alice McCoy technically exists, especially coming off the heels of the set mechanic Jogress, where its whole thing was just shitting Digimon out. So, it's very easy for Blue Green Imperial to just create another Digimon to potentially reduce the cost of something else. Um, but I don't want to, I guess, drag on too long. We don't want to go too long tonight. Um, the biggest thing that I guess I wanted to really relate all of this to, and all of these mechanics and complexity, is to the new player experience and how that's really changed in the span of a single year. Like we're still a very new card game as far as card games are concerned, and we are already seeing this potential like mechanical bloat where uh, trying to explain to someone who is just learning the game as of this set BT7 was kind of hard because you were telling them, okay, you play your level 3, you hatch your egg, your digivolve, you draw, you digivolve to level 4. That's your first turn. But then they'd go up against people in, locals or whatever, and not a single person would do that except for the few people that saw an evoable rookie in the form of like blue or red. And but everybody else would either like slam a Boko or slam a Tamer.
Yeah, and because I've been teaching one of my younger brothers how to play, and he's he's pretty okay at Magic. That was his big first foray into a card game. He's not amazing, but he's not like awful. He understood it for the most part, and he's trying to learn Digimon. And the barrier to entry, I noticed, was a lot higher compared to his twin counterpart. Yes, I do have twin younger brothers. One of them's been playing Digimon from the beginning, and he's just a lot more adversed into just how Digimon plays, and obviously he wins because of the experience, but it's a lot harder to teach somebody new all of these extra mechanics, all of these little nuances to keep up with. Because it's just like now he has to think, oh, I have a hybrid. I need to remember all of my abilities, which I'm already struggling with. Because it's he's not used to all of these yet. Um, on top of now he has to keep track of like, oh, Jagras or DNA Digivolve doesn't make my Digimon have summoning sickness or in a sense. So now they could swing wider way with armor Digimon Digivolve weird. What is this black text box? What does that mean? I've never seen that before. Like there is a point where it's just like it can be a little much at times, especially for the brand new player.
And I think a lot of the difficulty mostly just kind of comes with the almost not errata-ing, but like just the idea that because the newer cards are more, I guess there's more up to date. They're more modern as far as the design is coming along. You don't have those weird incongruencies that older decks had to deal with. I mean, I'm fairly certain there was even like a higher profile event where a player was playing their TK and recovering or and pulling the red Rise Greymon and then recovering because it's treated as yellow in like on the board it's always treated as yellow, but you still couldn't digivolve into it. Um, you could digivolve into raising, but it's not treated as yellow Digimon in your security. It's technically just red, even though it can digivolve off yellow or red, and on the field it's yellow and red. But in the security, it's just whatever color the card is, which is red. And now you have stuff like, oh, I can take my yellow Armadillomon and I can digivolve it into the green yellow Digmon. Or are there any off-colored examples, or am I just bad at this?
No, so I think the better example would be the blue Armadillomon can
Yeah,
digivolve into the yellow-green Digmon just because it
yeah,
says Armadillomon.
that's what
Like,
I meant.
granted, it's pretty self-explanatory, but like color-wise, if somebody's just being introduced to the game, that would make very little sense because of just the core basics of the game. And a lot of Japanese lists and further sets are really taking advantage of the name-based synergies to do absolutely wild things, which is kind of cool. But it definitely adds to the overall complexity on top of all of the rule management that we already have to keep track of. Just because sometimes ordering triggers and what is triggering and how things are affecting one another does still matter. And even high level players still kind of screw up sometimes on what should be going first in terms of the order of operations on how effects trigger, and this is just more things to add to that stack of things now that they have to keep track of and remember.
And I guess to really add into that, though, that point is the idea that the triggers themselves or the mechanics of the game are just getting more complex themselves. So it's easier to screw them up. Um, I mean, a lot of what the Black X antibody wants to do now, there's like a couple specific combination of factors that enable plays that otherwise just don't seem immediately evident. I know it was what really drew me to Black X Antibody initially was watching a match um, on the Card Protagonist channel, I believe actually specifically, and it was BT8's version of X Antibody, and you um, they had digivolved into Hisaryumon, the BT8 level 5, and they then swung, and the effect of um, Hisaryumon states when you place a Digivolution card under it, you may Digivolve Hisaryumon into an X antibody by paying its cost, but reducing that cost by 1. So it can't inherently gain sources, but the new Tamer allows you to tap the Tamer and then add a source to an X antibody Digimon when swinging, so then that you could swing with Hisaryu, tap the Tamer, add a source, which lets you Evo. They then immediately Evo into an Alphamon, but then they tuck Oriyumon, the new level 6. So now it's not a Hisaryu swinging for 1 check, it's an Alphamon swinging, and at the end of the attack it gains 2 memory, and because they've tucked an Oriyumon, end of attack, if its name is Alphamon, unsuspend it once per turn. So just the crazy, like the complexity of play involved with those specific interaction of mechanics is well above what we've seen previously. And I know a lot
On
of the
so
Joker's decks really go even further beyond that.
Yeah, on top of the fact that you'll still have some very basic rule questions where it's just like, okay, my Alphamon is attacking. I digivolved it off of the Oriumon. Do I get the when attacking ability? And the answer to that one would be no. Just spoilers, heads up. The answer to that one would be no because the when attacking was already declared. It is already in attack. Um, so you're missing the window. But that just goes to show like people will still ask that question because of just the awkwardness of how everything is playing. It's not really awkward. The
It's
complexity of how
yeah,
everything is playing out.
like we're at a point where like there are already some specific examples where certain cards are interacting and you're focusing on like subtexts of mechanics, like how you can play Call from Darkness, like do as much as you can. If you don't have a Digimon to delete, you can just play it and just pull two cards from your trash. Um, and stuff like that has been like fairly complex rulings, but um, like the idea that um, I know I was playing with um, Black War Greymon and um, Black War Greymon's ability is when an opponent's Digimon is deleted, unsuspended all turns. That runs completely counter to all of the Armor Purge Digimon who state if this Digimon were to be deleted, trash the top card. And it actually even begged a really weirdly specific scenario where I had piercing and I swung into an unsuspended Digimon that had Armor Purge, and we had to really look up exactly what does the piercing occur. I technically swung into it and it didn't die, but the opponent's Digimon didn't die. So do I like questions we never had to ask before until now?
And like there this goes back to like even BT7 with stuff like Takuya where it's just like he has a very awkward ability where it's just like the way he wants to work is you're supposed to digivolve for doing this but you don't have to and you could just shove cards underneath and that's just something completely different and it's going to actually be really interesting to see how that mechanics works with some of the other mechanics where it's just like okay now in BT10 we're starting to see tamers want to shove cards underneath so now you have a card that could help facilitate that in a different manner than what they might anticipate so like it's just I don't want to say it's getting too much and the game is becoming harder. It's just um like there's just it could be a lot going on to take in all at once. Or even if you've been playing, it's still just a lot to take on depending on the set and what you're trying to gain.
Yeah, a lot of the cards too, I guess, are being more printed with these more complex mechanics, and like it's not necessarily immediately obvious what you're meant to do. Looking at blue green Jogress, it looked cute. It looked like okay, cool. We've had technically this sub archetype of blue since the beginning, where you could, take sources and play them, and sometimes you gain value from doing that, and cards that want to be played from sources, and it was kind of like the Hexablau Azulong um, lines, where it's like there was this cute little source removal thing, and no one really took it seriously until Blue Hybrid adopted it, and now Blue Green Jogress is taking this like source, but now they have Jogress, and it's way more evident. I know Zenitsu and I were talking about the idea that like blue or Imperial Dramon's always been about multi-swinging, and there just now exists a line of play where you raise a level 5 and you swing with Pile Dramon, unsuspend itself, swing again, digivolve into the new dragon mode from the starter deck, tap the blue green tamer, unsuspend it, pull the two fours out, go into a new Pyldramon and swing twice again, and then swing with the dragon mode again. That's a lot to happen in a single turn, and it's fairly high rolly, but there's not a whole lot you could do to stop that because that entire line of play I just mentioned costed a whole 4 memory because the Jogress is free.
Well, I mean, you still have to pay to you have like it's not exactly that way, but like yes, there is just a lot of really powerful shenanigans that you could do just because of just trying to line up these specific abilities to gain the most out of your cards might not be the most straightforward thing. Granted, they try to make it super straightforward by making the cards interact with each other on purpose. So they want you to Jogress using Xvmon and Stingmon to go into a Pyldramon to multi-swing to then go into an Imperialdramon to separate and then go into another Pyldramon and then be able to swing with said Pyldramon. Like they made that very straightforward and simple as long as you have a basic understanding of Digimon and how their natural evolution lines want to play. But like trying to do other stuff on top of that is also another really hard and daunting thing for a lot of potential players because now you could use some older cards in combination with the newer cards to do some even more crazy things just because they share something very similar with one another.
Yeah, I know. Um, a lot of I guess a lot of archetypes are introduced, and um, a lot of these archetypes just continue to receive support, and it's something Zenitsu and I had a previous discussion about in regards to like, is that a good thing or a bad thing, and the potential like upsides and downsides of it. We're currently in good thing territory. I mostly tried to just like play devil's advocate and advocate for a world where that's a bad thing, but um, as long as we're in a world where you're evaluating the old cards and they're not strictly worse than the new cards being printed for the same archetype, um, mostly like in the case of Imperialdramon was my example, then you just kind of are seeing power creep and you're kind of just playing the same deck with a new coat of paint. But uh, as they're printing cards and allowing for flexibility within an archetype, I think it's a really good place to be. Like with the idea of the X antibody deck, it continues to expand. It gets new tools in 7, 8, 9, and the deck has too many pieces to run all of them as of 9, and so it has to start subdividing. There's more than one black X antibody deck as a BT9, which I think a really good place to be in.
And that's just a good place to like kind of you like you said, it's a good place to be in because it just allows you to be able to use your cards differently and it still makes your cards hold value. So like we know we're getting more Ragnarlordmon stuff, so that's gonna help flesh out some of the old Ragnarlordmon stuff. We're getting a whole bunch of like just new tools to help some of the old tools out. Now that all of those old tools are already laid out and those foundations are already made, going completely full circle. And this is just a really fun and interesting spot for the game to be in because of all of the different possibilities, not only in just how we have to play our cards, but to what our cards can do, what our cards are interacting with, and what cards we're using as a whole. And even though that could be a little bit daunting, especially if you're just coming in, we're almost 8 sets in English. Japan is like almost 10 sets in, not including the extra sets or EX sets. So like there's still just a lot of catch up work, and there is just a lot to take in. But like once you get past that initial barrier and you just understand some of the basics and slowly build upon your knowledge, like it will eventually just become second nature and it'll become a little bit easier over time. It just might take a little bit more time now that there's a lot more mechanics and a lot more complexity because of all of this.
Yeah, and even with BT8 being delayed, I know a lot of people are upset about that. Some small people, or I guess a small minority of people are excited that they don't have to spend the money immediately. Um, but the extension of BT7 doesn't necessarily mean a lot to me. I mean, having played in all of the major online events of BT7 that I'm going to, I'm just kind of just transitioning my decks over and starting to practice BT8 already. Um, but the next couple sets at least, I would say they're following more along the lines of Magic in the footsteps at least of making block-based sets, and I think we're walking towards the heart of this block. Seven being somewhat like the introduction to it, but not exactly. But we're really like the eight EX2 9 block. Looks just really strong as far as the deck variety and the options you have for when selecting different pieces for those decks. Because we're seeing more fleshed out archetypes, and as a result, you don't have to run like the BT7X antibody. You only have 20 of them, so you're just gonna run 4 copies of them, and then the other 30 cards in your deck are not even X antibody cards.
And while that makes the deck clunkier, it also opens up deck space. Like it's just really deck construction in Digimon is just really I don't want to say it's an art all of its own. It's just a really interesting experience to try to take part in, especially if you're newer, just because it is completely different than most other card games in terms of what you're looking out for. Just because we have different ways to build our deck depending on what we're trying to support and what the deck is trying to do, on top of the fact that now we have two colors to make things even more complicated in case you are trying to transition from one color to the next. There's just a lot to take in to make the game really fun and engaging once you have a good understanding of what you're trying to do and what the deck is trying to do and how to play that deck.
I also think these this is kind of I think the designers kind of really flexing their muscles for the first times in a number of design spaces, and um this is their set that kind of proves they can design sets, I guess, that are thematic. They have, color identities, they have mechanical identities, and they've kind of, I mean, I guess we'll see when it comes out in English because we tend to break things more often than um, other areas of the world, but just the idea that we're not going to necessarily hard break anything in this set like we did with Rookie Rush, with SecCon, um, Megazoo. Like, I don't necessarily see any of these cards being abused in that fashion. I know they've planted the seed a little bit with the two color tamers and the color agnostic tamers, I guess, in the form of the new Ghost Game tamers. But like I don't see anyone taking these cards and using them in ways that they weren't designed to be used. Like we wanted Rookie Rush, we got Rookie Rush, and they found a way to print Rookie Rush that plays by the rules at least. It plays by its own rules, but it still plays by the rules.
I mean that, and there's just more counters. So like part of the problem was like they didn't fully understand what their game was capable of because it just started. So now that they have a better understanding, we have the Armor Rush, aka Rookie Rush 2.0, and then we have Security Control, aka Mastimon, Jagras / DNA. Like
Yeah.
they are catering to what people were trying to do with these cards, and they're trying to make it more fun and engaging while still keeping it within not necessarily its own bubble, but like under a certain level of their control rather than something unforeseen and unpredictable. Like,
And
granted, they still probably have a couple of design oversights, Magna Angemon, but that aside,
I was even gonna say that, yeah, um, cause um, I think a good sign, cause if we really are going to be an eternal format, which I'm still not 100% on board with the idea of eternal format and what it potentially means for a card game, but we are an eternal format, so let's play by the rules of an eternal format. Let's make eternal cards relevant, and the idea that the the new yellow purple Mastemon slash yellow hybrid control um really leans into it and uses old cards and old mechanics in a new way um is really cool, and how that stupid card continues to show its face in control decks indefinitely. um I mean, I might build it. I might at least play around with it a little bit. I'm not going to play it as my primary deck, but I'll at least see if it's fun and not boring like Security Control has been.
I think it's going to be way more engaging than Security Control just because it's not super hardcore focused on, oh, I recover, pass, do nothing. and hope you hit my security, and then security threat comes out, and then haha, surprise, you lose the game because you hit my security. I think it's a little bit more proactive, which is making it more interesting. Which again, they took a look at security control. They said that was kind of stupid, and they kind of, I don't want to say fixed it because security control was inherently a problem. And this goes to like the speed of the game, where it's just like you are going to have those control decks and you are going to have those aggro decks. So there is both ends of the spectrum being well represented to help try to flesh out the rock paper scissors esque meta that usually you want to try to have. So that way, one deck doesn't necessarily dominate too hard, like we're seeing with blue hybrids currently in BT7. But that's a completely separate issue. That's not necessarily the complexity of the game. That is just, just a little bit of oversight in terms of like how they designed their game
I
and
also
their cards.
I think BT8's at least the first set that we know of, um, to my knowledge also, where um, a deck doesn't just go from like tier 1 to tier 3 in the span of a set. Um, you know, Gabu Bond stop seeing play immediately in the span of a set. Blue hybrids will probably just stop seeing play in the span of a set. Lord Nightmon ultimately kind of just stopped seeing play in the span of a set, you know. Um,
Well,
and
like this is where like those foundations were laid out, and the new foundations usually is what people led to. And now that we could actually have cards to interact with some of those older cards and make them more meaningful, that's where some excitement can happen. Because Chimeramon makes Lord Nightmon way more usable because it could play a level 4 for free. Um,
yeah, I still don't think it's
Bonds,
good
but
though.
Bond is still, I mean, yes, there's other better things that you could do, but if you are a hardcore Lord Nightmon fan, you do have a card now to continue to try to play
I,
Lord Nightmon with.
you always could though. I mean like I'm talking like competitive, like where you're not gonna see a tier 1 deck fall from tier 1 to tier 3 in the span of a set. And even looking at like I was going over like organizing my cards today as like just swapping out sleeves, preparing for BT8 cards that aren't out yet. Um, I don't need to change out as many cores as in previous sets. I mean, I'm changing my EX1 Imperial deck for a blue-green Imperial deck, and a lot of those cards are just kind of going away and probably not coming back. But outside of that, I'm just making different yellow hybrid. It's just adding things and just swapping out pieces while the archetype is potentially staying the same. And um, you know, the best deck potentially being blue green Jogress of BT8. Um, it's still a thing in EX2. It's still a thing in BT9, way less so, but probably. But that's I think the starter deck ones are like the exception because they do get the starter deck immediately as most of their support, and then very little else.
I mean, yeah, but like that just goes to show like they needed to lay those foundations first, and sometimes new foundations are still being laid, and that's kind of like why decks don't necessarily disappear as often, and like even still decks can come back. So like even though in BT7, Bella Starmon took a bit of a dip in terms of popularity and overall play, now at least in Japan she's making a comeback. Why? Because you have new cards for her to play with as of BT9. So, like, decks can come in and out based on the types of support and interactions that are going to be made to help that deck flow and function, which is the cool thing because all of those foundations needed to be laid down first. So they're not like trying to kill off decks or like completely have you replace decks. They're just giving you more tools for a lot of decks to continue to be iterated upon.
Yeah. Um, I guess my last thing, um, again regarding the new players, is just that it's a lot harder to answer new player questions now than it used to be, only because they look at a game that includes their favorite characters and a game that has a color identity to it. And a lot of players attach the, like, I'm not just a tamer, I'm a blue tamer, or I'm a green tamer. And that idea, as we get more archetypical, you lose that a little bit because, you can't just say, hey, I'm a new player and I want to play blue. And you'd be like, okay, cool. You're going to need some Davis and you're going to need, some of this and that. And like, because the staple blue colors, like, you kind of have to ask a secondary question of which blue deck do you want to play? Because I'm going to recommend you a very different list if you want to play Gabu Bond or blue hybrids. They're both very blue, and they do blue things, but they're not the same deck. So if you're a new player asking those kinds of like real top-down questions, like, "Ooh, do you like red or black better?" Like, I don't know.
And I think like each color does have its own level of aggro, control, mid-range. And like there are more questions that need to be asked from the new player which they won't be able to ask, let alone answer half the time because they're so new and they don't know anything. And it's becoming, like you said, a little bit harder to answer those because it's just like somebody could ask for a yellow deck because they like angels. It's just like, okay, well, do you want to play Mastamon? Do you want to play angels? Do you want to play yellow hybrids? Like, which one do you want? And then you're just overwhelming them immediately with all of the different options. And we only just started with a lot of these different foundations, and we're not even that far into the game. And it's already becoming harder to recommend things to newer players because of all of the differences in which these decks can be playing with, even though they all share a color identity, not even mentioning archetypal based decks that are completely different from what the rest of the color wants to be playing like. Diaboromon. But
hmm
regardless, sometimes that makes it easier, sometimes that makes it harder. It depends on how they're asking the question and what they're trying to actually gain out of the game.
So I believe that's all the time we have for today, but I think this was a good starting point for talking about BT8 and more of the discussion that'll come with the inclusion of these new cards in the future. If you have any new ideas or questions, make sure to leave them in the comment section below. Um, I know Zenitsu and I still probably read all of them at this point. There's usually no more than 10.
Yeah, I still read them all.
And with that, we'll have to close it out for this week. Goodbye.
Bye.